So my guest on today's show is Timothée Parrique. He is a social scientist, ecological economist, degrowth scholar, originally from Versailles, France. Tim holds a PhD in economics from University of Clermont, Auvergne, France, and the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University, Sweden. He's currently a professor and researcher at the School of Economics and Management at Lund University in Sweden. His first book, Slow Down or Perish, The Economics of Degrowth, came out in 2022, quickly rose to become a bestseller in France, I believe. He's recently gone into, or I've recently gone into a deep degrowth rabbit hole thanks to Tim. He's a brilliant researcher, educator on the topics of degrowth, post-growth, and heterodox economies. Also an entertaining and I find super insightful communicator on these topics. Lots of hot takes, some of the most important and pressing issues of our time. So Tim, welcome to the show. So thrilled to have you on.
Hello. Very happy to be here.
Awesome. So, one of the things I was hoping just to reset the get the conversation set on common ground here. It might sound like a setup to a bad joke, but I'm wondering, like, what's the difference between an economist and an ecological economist?
I should definitely think about making a joke about this.
Yeah.
Well, economics is a discipline of study in general, and we usually subdivide economics into a number of schools of thought. At least, the big seven. So you have neoclassical economics, is what we usually refer to as mainstream economics. That's the economics you learn if you go to your average university. If you pick up the average textbook or you see the average economist on TV, that's neoclassical economics. It's one way out of several ways, at least seven, to do economics. And the rest, what is not neoclassical economics, we call it heterdox economics. And that usually includes at least six schools of thought: Marxian economics, post-Keynesian economics, institutional economics, Austrian economics, feminist economics, and I'm answering your question there, ecological economics. And so when you say you're an ecological economist, it means I'm just a normal economist, meaning I'm trying to answer questions about poverty, inequality, about production, about consumption, about exchange, but I'm using a specific analytical lens, which is the one of ecological economics, and let's say a school of thought that was born in the 1980s. And what makes an ecological economist special compared to a feminist, a Marxian, a post-Keynesian economist, is that whenever I'm looking at the economy, I'm always wearing glasses that shows me flows of energy and matter. So when I'm looking at an economy, first, I don't even see euros. Economists usually, when they start at they're trying to answer an economic questions, they frame it in money. For me, before we even talk about money, every economy is just, a movement of energy, matter, some of them being animated into ecosystems and ecosystem services and animals, and then humans using their time to do things. So before we even look at money, there's this whole kind of ecological, you could say, economy that is underlying the monetary economy. And so my field of my specialty, and what we're going to be discussing today, economic growth and degrowth and post-growth, is basically looking at concepts of extraction, production, consumption from the lens of ecological economics, as to see stuff that other economists perhaps have neglected over the years because that was not part of their glasses.
Yeah, that's right. Is it like so like I just spoke to a woman who's a systems scientist or interested in the systems thinking. So do you say it's a kind of like a systems view of the economy, a broadening out of the picture?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so I've heard you talk about degrowth as a house with many doors, and you could go in and describe it in different ways depending on the person you're speaking to. So I'd imagine this is a general audience. Maybe the term degrowth, this is the first time they're hearing it. I'm wondering if you could do a quick introduction of degrowth. Maybe like imagine you're explaining it to like a 5-year-old or to me.
Oh, that's Well, my favorite analogy is the one of the diet. I think we all understand that, we have bodies, and so we ingest food and we reject some of that food and we retain other part of these calories. And so we understand that some of that food intake is necessary for daily activity. You need to eat to move around, and you need to eat much more when you're growing, when you're a kid. Every year you just, you add more kilos and centimeters to your metabolism. So you need to make up for that by taking stuff outside of your body. And economy is the same. If you want to produce and consume more stuff year after, you need to go into nature and find energy and matter. The problem, and that also happens in humans, sometimes you take on too much. That leads to two kind of problems.
Mm.
First, sometimes there's just not enough then for you to eat outside, which is leading to a scarcity problem. Or this is leading to, let's say, a disruption of your metabolism. You become, let's say, very, very obese, and that creates a lot of health issues.
Mm.
So here we can see degrowth first and foremost as this process of, in situations where we've been taking too much from outside into our economies and we end up in situations of macroeconomic obesity, then we need to go through a macroeconomic diet.
Yeah.
So we need to produce and consume less as to slow down the rate at which we're using natural resources. That's kind of how I would explain it to a 5 years old. I
Yeah.
think there's much more to it, but that's a first part. With regardless of the degrowth argument, this kind of biophysical imperative to consume less natural resources in order to be sustainable over the long term, that never goes away. It's always there.
Yeah, it's such like a the what's strange. It's such an obvious idea. Like when you think about how all other living systems kind of operate, use the human body as a great metaphor. We do grow to a certain point, and then like the material growth hopefully stops unless there's a need for a diet, like you said. But at the same time, it's such a wild idea. Someone who's rooted in the United States, the idea of an economy that isn't grounded in growth, like as if that's not the obvious thing you're going after. It's such a obvious and wild idea at the same time. And so like trying to grok those two at the same time uh, is one of the things I find so fascinating about this. I want to like get your take on this. Post pandemic, it does seem like we're moving into a phase where there's a greater recognition that maybe the systems or institutions around us aren't working or aren't in the best interest or serving us the way we would hope. I think about things like on Reddit, the growth of like late stage capitalism as a subreddit, or anti-growth as a as a subreddit as well, or the recent bank runs and what's happening in financial markets. So I'm wondering for you, if is it do you have a similar sense from your point of view that there's this growing recognition, and if does that somehow translate into an opportunity for degrowth?
Yeah, and before I answer that, and there's a lot to say about this, I was just wondering if I could sneak in a little official definition of degrowth here
Yeah, great.
that a 5 years old might not understand, but
Yeah.
I think that some listeners will appreciate. Because so degrowth is not only this biophysical imperative. In the way I've defined it, there's four key elements into the concept of degrowth: sustainability, democracy, social justice, and well-being. And the way I would articulate it, if I had to make, a one-sentence dictionary definition of the term, I would say degrowth is a downscaling of production and consumption to
Mm-hmm.
lighten ecological footprints, planned democratically in a way that is equitable and for the sake of improving well-being.
Mm.
So here we have these four elements that coexist. The first one is the factual bit. That's the one I talked about. Like, an economy can do three things. If you look at it in the aggregate macroeconomic way, it can produce and consume more one year after the other. It can produce and consume less, or it can produce and consume the same, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And degrowth focuses on that specific niche of arguing that in countries that are currently in biophysical overshoot, meaning they're using more resources than their fair share, for example, carbon or energy or materials or water or biodiversity or soil, then these countries need to just reduce production and consumption at the aggregated level in order to lighten ecological footprint. That's the macroeconomic diet, but that leaves out three important elements that you find in the degrowth literature, and that is the fact that this big macroeconomic diet is planned democratically, so that's not something that's happening like an external shock or just the morning decision of a dictator somewhere deciding, oh, we're just going to stop the economy. No, that's something that is conscious, deliberative, participatory, democratic in one word. And then it's organized based on these two elements so that it's equitable and convivial. So the equitable bit is very important because when we're talking about environmental pressures, that always connect to inequality. Today we have a very strong correlation between income and footprints, and even more between wealth and footprints. Basically, the richer you are, the more you pollute. And so when we're talking about reducing overall ecological footprint, we need an approach that is proportional. We cannot be like, oh, everyone is going to tighten their belt. That would not be effective and that would not be fair because we don't all have the same vulnerability and action power. So that's the bit about equitable. Who's going to consume less? Who's going to produce less? Where? When? How fast? All these questions have to do with equity. And then there's the other bit, the conviviality bit. I like the term convivial in French. It's just this good living, the idea of the good life. And I framed in my research degrowth as basically a form of improving our economy work. I mean, what's an economy for? An economy is a social system that is designed to satisfy unmet needs. That's why we have economies. We cooperate together to do things we cannot do on our own. And at the end of the day, that help us to satisfy needs, and so that increase our quality of life. And so the goal of degrowth is basically to undergo this diet and all the big transformations that are necessary in order to be able to do it, to improve quality of life. So this is not a sacrifice, and it's based, and that's how I'm going to smoothly transition to your question. It's based on a critique of growth-based capitalism. So the economic system that we have in most high-income countries, that is basically inadequate, not only because it's unsustainable biophysically, but also because it performs very poorly at satisfying equity standards first, but also at just satisfying needs. And so through these transformations of the economy we're going to talk about, we'll see that some of the stuff you'll be like, oh, there's no connection to sustainability. There's always a connection either to well-being, to equity, to democracy, or to sustainability. And it's really the coexistence of these four objectives into one strategy that I think makes a degrowth a concept that is gathering momentum now because people see it as being analytically useful.
Yeah, I can see that as well, and maybe there's like almost a revaluation of what the economy is before, right? Like a waking up to this could be serving us differently.
Yeah. I mean, I just give you a small example. This morning, I went to a pharmacy, just picking up some medicine,
Yep.
and it's a pharmacy in a small kind of French village. And then I've just noticed that they installed huge screens all over one wall of the pharmacy showing just moving videos of ads basically for different pills and drugs. And I'm like, this is the perfect example of a system that is somehow completely locked in a growth treadmill where basically you have all actors interacting that want to sell stuff. So the people making these kind of screens have an incentive to sell more, and the people having of the pharmacy have an incentive to sell more drugs, and the people making advertising have an incentive to do this. And then we end up having these stuff that you could very easily say like, well, if these screens disappear tomorrow, no one's gonna die. They don't correspond to a specific need. And when you connect this to the fact that we have limited biophysical budgets, then that becomes problematic, because it means having digital screens in every single pharmacy means we won't have batteries for some electric cars somewhere, means we won't have wires for someone to get internet somewhere, most probably in the global south, means, that on a world that is finite,
Right.
the use of natural resources in one place is, the you lose the ability to use it in another place. That
Right.
in economics we often say, economics is not a zero-sum game. And that's true.
Yeah.
But ecological economics always is a zero-sum game, because we don't create energy, we don't create materials. We can only use what is available on Earth, and that is just as both like a quantity limit and also a speed limit for certain things like renewable energy and ecosystem services.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of sufficiency, which I've heard you talk about and you mentioned in your that seems like a term you don't hear about a lot. It's not at least in the US, a value folks are striving towards, but sufficiency being maybe a central theme of that. Like, is this essential? Is it needed for what makes a good life? Right? Like the screens in the pharmacy. Is that sufficient? Probably not.
There's the concept of sufficiency that gained quite some importance in the last IPCC report, and in the last IPCC report, if I remember well, they define it as something like, measures or policies and or daily practices that avoid the demand for energy, materials, land, water, and other natural resources. And so here it is we're focusing on minimizing the use of natural resources, but we're not rediscussing the actual need. We don't care about having like very low energy digital screen and pharmacy. We're just like, we don't need them.
Right.
So we don't care about having like very complex compensation scheme, for the biodiversity that was destroyed when we extracted the minerals and the metals necessary to run these panels. We're like, no. I mean, we could have, if we at the beginning somehow had a social political discussions about what do we need, what is our biocapacity, what do we prefer to do? Do you prefer to have this or that? And in the this or that, I'm pretty sure that the screen in the pharmacy would have been bottom of the list. And so we see here that like reframing economics as the political organization of need satisfaction first makes things a bit more concrete, because right now, look, we've not even talked about money yet. I mean, that's amazing. 22 minutes into an economics podcast and we've not talked about money.
Right.
So that's the one point that is interesting. It connects back economics to reality, and reality is before money is not real. Time used, your 24 hours you have per day, that's real. The food you eat is real. The temperature of your body is real. The materials you use on your shirt and your house and everything to light that's real. The money is just monopoly points we print ourselves in order to organize the allocation of these stuff.
Yeah.
So here we need to divide between these two. And the second point, starting with sufficiency, what's interesting, starting with the satisfaction of unmet needs, that it opens a possibility that not that many economists talk about, which is the possibility of having enough. If you manage to identify an unmet need, like, look, I really need that medicine for that disease we don't have the access to medicine for, and you manage to just agitate yourself, produce that medicine, allocate that medicine, and then you have access to it. Then there's no point, producing 3% more of it every year. You have it.
Right.
So same thing, then we reframe economics as always trajectory of satisfaction. What do we need to do in order to get to a specific point? And that logic runs completely opposite to the ideology of growth, which is basically that treadmill fashion of everything, including GDP and profits and income and purchasing power and whatever you want, needs to increase by X% every year, always and forever.
Right. Right. So walk me through, like, can you give me a bit of a timeline? I've seen a few different charts that looks like around the 70s, there was a bit of like a break where people started saying like, hey, is growth actually good for us? Should we be thinking about things differently? So I'm wondering if you could give like a bit of a timeline of this kind of school of thought around degrowth. How do we get here?
Yeah. Well, the ecological economics we talk about, which is really the school of thought that kick-started reflections that later became degrowth. The term degrowth emerged in France in 2002 only. but we're going to come back a bit before that in the 70s. At the end of the 60s already, American economist Kenneth Boulding was making an interesting analogy. It was making the difference between the cowboy economy and the spaceman economy. It was saying, like, the cowboys' way of thinking is you just set camp, you just, you take whatever food you need, you throw whatever trash you have, and when everything is soiled and you want more food, you just move to the next hill.
Yep.
And he's saying, like, well, right now we have these economies that are extractivist, they're linear, they are short term, and they have no limits. What we need is a spaceman economy. Like, if you go to the International Space Station, everything is being reused and recleaned because, I mean, you're in the middle of a space. You cannot just, once you're done with food, move to no, there's no other bit. And so Kenneth Boulding, and here we see that's the first insight that's going to ramify into a school of thought to be like, wow, our planet is like a spaceship. Is actually not infinite and as big as you think. And how long can we run these growth-based linear extractivist economy on a planet that is finite? And so you kind of like be like, wow, in economics, we've never thought about this kind of careful stewardship of our ecological spaceship. And Kenneth Boulding is the one we remember for saying, like, only a madman or an economist would believe that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet, which is something he said at the beginning of the 1970s. But that Kenneth Boulding, I think most people don't know, but what most people would know is the Limits to Growth report from 1972.
Yep.
And what was interesting there is, like, the kind of theories there was in ecological economics, Kenneth Boulding. There was also this Romanian genius mathematician, Nicolae Georgescu-Roegen, which published in 1971 a book called The Entropy Law in the Economic Process, based on some of his research in the 1960s. And just before we get to the limits to growth, I mean, this guy, I've read it during the beginning of my PhD, and my mind was just blown away. That guy studied economics, was a very well-respected mainstream economist. I mean, he was first a mathematician, so he came into economics in the hard quantitative way. And then at some point, he realized something odd. He was like, the assumptions we take in economic theories, they run counter to the laws of physics, including the laws of thermodynamics. So the fact that we, cannot create or destroy energy, but we just transform it. So if you just if you burn a lot of oil, well, at some point there won't be enough oil. And also the oil is not disappearing to another planet. It's staying in the atmosphere, choking you and heating up the planet.
Yeah.
And also the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy, being like there's a constant, unavoidable degradation of the quality of energy. When you burn a barrel of oil, that's very useful energy. You can translate that into a lot of movement. But once it's diffused in the air, you have the same quantity of energy, but it's not as useful for humans. Right. And so Georgescu-Roegen was like, wow, guys. What if we were to rewrite economic theory as to make it compatible with not only the laws of physics, but also the law of biology? Because he believed, and I think that's fair to argue, that any economy is made of people, which are animals, and machines, which are made of materials and are using energy. So somehow an economy is fundamentally, dependent on the laws of biology. Yeah. And on the laws of physics. And so it's like, we need to somehow understand the economy as being embedded within nature necessarily. And so he went on and wrote this very complicated economic theory that is the one thinker that led, like, one of his books. So this a couple of his texts were translated in France at the end of the 1970s, and in the translation for the title they used the word décroissance, degrowth. Nicolas was fluent in France. He agreed, even though in his English he was talking about like declining state, stuff like that. It was like, okay, décroissance, why not? Yeah. And that term décroissance, because it was sounding so outrageous, so critical towards croissance, which already at the end of the 70s was quite like not a dogma, but like quite a strong ideology. Like croissance was the way to go. Economic growth was good. So talking with degrowth was just plain outrageous. And it is this kind of those first ideas in the 70s that led at the beginning of the 2000s to a diverse group of activists and scholars to be like, you know what, let's bring back the concept of décroissance. Just one word about the limits to growth, because
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned it, was saying that was a group of mathematicians and engineers at MIT that just built one of the first computer model which you could use to simulate global scenarios of sustainability. And what they've reached is basically what Kenneth Boulding and Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen argued, namely that, well, you have a finite planet. If you look at what we're using today and we assume that every year is going to grow this and that, after some point, there's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Either we're going to run out of resources or we're going to run out of places to just stock our trash or end up being choked by it. And
Yeah.
so that was the famous limits to growth claim, which was not completely original, but the original bit was this kind of empirical feel of like, look at the model. The model shows this and that. The logic is sound. It was not a predictive model, but it was, a model to explain the
Yep.
logic that it connects. It computes well together. And
Yep.
no, I'm jump back to the 2000s, and I swear I won't continue too much after that. People
Great.
interested can read the chapter 5 of my thesis, The Political Economy of Degrowth, where I
Mm.
really go the long way to explain these 3 phases from the end of the 60s to today. But so these people in 2002, in a small activist magazine in France, they decide to talk of décroissance conviviale, convivial degrowth. And back then, beginning of the 2000s, the concept of sustainable development is very popular within sustainability discourses. And so they're like, oh, wow,
Mm.
sustainable development is a bit of a capitalist, growth-based discourse. It doesn't make the difference between global South countries that needs to produce and consume a lot more and, early industrialized countries that have already macroeconomically reach levels of sufficiency but keep insisting on growing more.
Yeah.
And these people were like, if we have limited biophysical budgets, we cannot have both. So we need somehow two concepts. And they're like, let's keep sustainable development, or even call it something different, for countries that actually need to produce and consume more.
Yep.
And then let's talk of convivial degrowth for the global north. Countries that somehow can have prosperity without growth, and will need to undergo this temporary macroeconomic diet to liberate resources so that they can function sustainably, and so that countries in the global south have the ecological space they need to
Mm.
develop.
Got it. Yeah, that's a really helpful backdrop. I mean, one of the things I wanted to hopefully do now is I've seen you put this slide up before, which helps situate kind of like a spectrum of different ways of looking at growth. I had heard about green growth a whole bunch of times before I heard about degrowth. I was wondering if maybe you could just kind of situate us on this map where degrowth sits within other schools of thought.
Yeah. So it was the frame of my thesis where I thought like the controversy around growth is today the ultimate controversy when we talk about sustainability.
Yeah.
And so there's a very clear divide between this pro-growth position, which can take different forms and can be in defense of capitalism, like natural capitalism, arguing that actually capitalism can be a solution to the ecological crisis, and so that we need more economic growth to generate, for example, resources, to invest more, to unfold faster renewable energy infrastructure, whatever you will, to circularize the economy. So you have these pro-growth concept and a lot of institutional framework, the European Green Deal, the idea of the green economy that basically is the follow-up of sustainable development, being okay, was sustainable development was popular for a while, then there's been the green economy turn, and now like green growth is basically the new sustainable development. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have people that consider that growth is not the solution but the problem.
Mm.
And very often these, even though there are a few disagreements and spectrum of scales in terms of radicality, most people, they also criticize capitalism and extractivism and neoliberalism. So you have a wider like systemic critique
Mm.
of how the economy function in that red anti-growth bit. And then you have a bit of a yellow like in between, people that have been kind of touching on this. And
Yep.
that graph I've made quite a few years ago. So now I would not place terms in the same way, but
Yep.
is I was making that to show that there's this interesting controversy going on. When you talk about economic growth, people will always take a position. You will never have someone be like, yeah, what about it? It's always
Yeah.
either, and even the growth skeptics, I think, is just a matter of like not taking a position willingly to not enter that debate,
Yep.
or just not taking a position because they just coined a concept, but then after some time they will somehow have to position themselves on the map.
And so that whole idea of green growth, which is over on the more mainstream side of the spectrum, is it fair to say that's synonymous with decoupling strategies, to basically say we can keep growing our economy and decouple the impacts from the growth economically? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's correct. So decoupling is the more scientific term behind the idea of green growth, which is more of a popular appellation.
Yep.
But green growth basically is economic growth or an increase in gross domestic product that is decoupled from environmental pressures. And when we say decoupled, we mean dissociated. So basically, you have GDP going up, growth, but you have measures of ecological footprints going down. So the two have completely lost correlation. And that is kind of the green growth hypothesis, that this is somehow either happening or possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's like after coming into a rabbit hole of all the stuff you talk about, I realized like there are so many what felt like little fallacies or little tricks or little ways that things are framed. So it might feel like as a consumer, hey, this is a good, this is green, it's sustainable, it's working well. But if you kind of zoom out one step back in space and time and look at this, you might realize like, well, this is sustainable in isolation, but in the bigger picture, this isn't something that's actually leading to a green kind of growth. So I felt like in Decoupling Debunked, one of a piece of work that you were a lead author on, you had in there like a checklist of ways to
Mm.
look at some decoupling research to be like, is this really as good as it seems? So I'm wondering if you can maybe like walk us through. You're someone who's looking to get into degrowth a bit more, better understand how effective are some of these decoupling strategies. What are some of the things to look out for or questions to ask about the research you're getting into to get to the bottom of its effectiveness?
Yeah, and this I so decoupling debunked was in the summer of 2019. It
Yeah.
was just straight adapted. It was chapter 2 of my PhD thesis, and back then I just thought like, oh, it's strange. People talk of decoupling, but they kind of never really specify what kind of decoupling, how much, how big, where, for how long. And I was wondering, like, is it just sloppiness? Is that me not understanding what's going on? And there was just no framework for it. So people
Right.
basically were just saying, "Oh, look, France is decoupled, the US is decoupled, everyone is decoupled, everyone is green, everything is fine." So a lot of people were then using these kind of numbers uh, to justify inaction. They're like, "No worry, the economics is greening on its own." And if you want to see the best example of that, a couple of months ago, I wrote a response to Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman published a
Mhm.
piece in the New York Times on green growth, which I think was just very mistaken. And so I've written a response on my blog. I think I've titled it like, growth is not as green as you might think.
Mhm.
And I went through the checklist, and I invite listeners to do that every time you hear someone telling you like, oh, look, growth is green, there's been decoupling. Then start by asking, uh, you know, what are we looking at? What kind of resources? Most often you will see, like, I think 90% of the time, they're only talking about carbon.
Right.
And so they're reducing sustainability, which is a very complex concept. We've seen from the perspective of ecological economics, sustainability means that whatever you're using in an economy needs to fit within the carrying capacities of your ecosystems, what we
Mhm.
call the biocapacity. So we're talking soil, species, water, waste generation, energy, metals, biomass, everything needs to be in line under planetary boundaries. And so if you manage to decouple one thing, let's say you take all the fossil car in the US,
Yeah.
and tomorrow magically you turn them into electric cars. and you'll feel so smug because you'll be like, look, we have less emissions, blah, blah, blah. And then you realize, wow, but an electric car requires up to 10 times more metals than a fossil car. So you would have decoupled one thing, maybe carbon emissions will reduce a bit, but you would have recoupled, use a lot more metals, which means you will dig a lot more, so you'll disturb soil and biodiversity, you'll use a lot more water, you'll produce a lot of more just polluted local air and water. And so here we see that like sometimes we just displace problem and we realize that this is not, this is not making an economy sustainable.
Right.
Second thing, so first, just that bit, usually that argument alone suffices to win the debate because so far there's no scientific evidence anywhere ever that has managed to show that a high income economy can sufficiently lower its total ecological footprint while producing and consuming more. So that's the one bit. You're like, if you want to reduce ecological footprint, and it seems like scientists are telling us, we need to reduce water use and energy use and greenhouse gas emissions and production of unrecyclable e-waste and, degradation of soil and biodiversity loss. If you want to do that, and it seems, countries want to do that, there's no other way. You need to produce and consume less. Yeah. But I'm still going to go down the checklist, even though it's a bit of an overkill. But then I've realized something interesting. You had countries like France that were like, look, we're greening our economy. We're reducing territorial greenhouse gases, meaning the greenhouse gases of the stuff you produce in France, like on land, in actual France. But then you realize, wait a second, we've been outsourcing, delocalizing like a lot of industries, including the most polluting ones.
Yep.
That have gone to Southeast Asia, to Eastern Europe. And so now we're just importing product from there. And so it looks like they're green. We drive more cars than we were before, but we don't produce them anymore. So somehow it looks green. And you're like, wait a second. But the way to produce these cars is worse because when you produce a Citroën in Slovakia, the carbon footprint of production is way higher than in France. Actually, the main reason why we produce it there is because it's cheap. And very often cheap means there's no high environmental standards.
Right.
So now what we're doing is we're kind of including imported emissions. We're doing the net balance between, emissions of the stuff we produce in France, for example, and we export, then you take it out of your responsibility, but you include all the emissions of the things you import. So we call that consumption-based emission. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters for your economy. If you drive a car, you take the responsibility from, using that car and having that car produced and that car shipped and that car recycled and all of that, because that's part of your lifestyle. And when you do this, you realize that a couple of miracles of greening are actually just reverted. They're not miracles. You've just been, it's like you want to lose 20 kilos and you take 20 kilos on your left leg and you put it on your right leg. You're like, and you're calling that weight loss.
Yeah. Or it's like when I ask the kids to clean I have kids and I ask them to clean the room. Instead of actually cleaning it, they'll just move the mess like under a different area. And you're like, it's less obvious, but the mess is still there. You have to clean the room.
Perfect analogy. They're expert in green growth.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so these are some of like the local global conflation around. Well, it might seem like we're doing really great locally, but actually we're just moving our pollution to a different place. I like the way you talk, like Herman Daly, the idea of was it sources and sinks, which I think is that like what's going into it and what's going out of the system. Those are a couple of the other ways you've talked about maybe offering a bit more critical analysis of the decoupling research.
Yeah, I mean, what matters here is what we call societal metabolism. So we're back to this analogy of an economy, as sources. So the kind of natural resources we extract in nature, metals, ores, biomass, water, fossil fuels, and then the sinks. So the stuff we throw our pollutions at, mostly, the oceans, the atmosphere, the soils. And right now, what we're realizing is that sustainability is a matter of scale. If you have a big metabolism, well, you're going to have what we call a big throughput. So the flow of energy and matter that go through your economy is going to be big. And, when you think about that, like decoupling appears to be a weird hypothesis because, I mean, could you name me one single economic activity that does not require energy and materials? Uh, First, anything that involves a human, then no, because you need food for nourishment, you need to be housed, you need to move yourself around, you need to wear clothes and all of that. Anything involving a tool doesn't work because tools are made of matter, and you need to build them by using energy, and you need energy to use them. So I think very quickly we realized that there's this microeconomic truth of whatever economic activity, what I like to call, like, economic agitation you want to have, you need to mobilize stuff. And somehow it's not like macroeconomically that stuff disappear just by the mere fact that you're not one, but you're just like 100 million in a country, and then, oh wow, that constraint just disappeared. No, we just, in high income countries, we've been basically overusing resources by taking, natural resources elsewhere. So that's the equity bit. But even if you were to go, there's been cases of countries, of course, developing eco innovations, technological progress that allowed them to have less polluting ways of producing and consuming, which is great. And so you do see in high income countries a certain decoupling. But then that opens another question, and here it's going to become a bit technical, but I think it's worth it. It's just, what kind of decoupling is it?
Right.
You can see on the graph that coupling means GDP goes up, ecological footprint goes up the same way. It's perfectly coupled. Then you can have what we call relative decoupling. So per unit of GDP, per unit of car you produce or whatever, you're a bit less energy and material intensive. But since you produce more cars than these kind of relative gains of efficiency, then the total amount of tons of CO2 per year you emit still increase. It doesn't increase as fast as before, but it still goes up. The problem is not solved. So that's my first criticisms, being like, if you've achieved relative decoupling, don't call that green growth.
Right.
Because emissions are still going up. You've not solved the problem. You've merely just slowed down the production of that problem. What we want is absolute decoupling. So you see the green curve here. We want GDP up, and we want the measure of the environmental indicator down. But even that is not enough, because if you reduce emissions, let's say in the US, by 0.1% per year, you get yourself absolute decoupling. Congratulations. That serves absolutely no purpose, and you will still warm the planet to death. What we want is, an absolute decoupling that is sufficient, meaning we want a trajectory of lowering that allow an economy to fall back within planetary boundary before a certain degradation. For the climate, we're talking in terms of global warming. For a lake, we may be talking before avoiding collapse of a certain ecosystems, like before all the fish die out. For fisheries, is very easy to understand. If you're overfishing today, you need to reduce overfishing before you have exhausted the entire ecosystems, and before we lose actually the ability for that ecosystem to reproduce, right? So we want that green curve. And that's that we want the red curve. And that's that curve we've not been observing anywhere in the world. And so that's why I find it a bit disingenuous when people say, oh, look, we've achieved green growth in the United States, like supposedly arguing like we're going in the right direction, and also supposedly arguing like we are sustainable today. The growth we have is actually not a problem anymore. It's a solution. I think that's false. But then I want to make a last argument, and this one is really the most powerful way of putting the decoupling argument on its head, is that economic growth can be counterproductive, can be uneconomic growth, as Herman Daly used to say. We've talked about it in the beginning a bit. You can have economic agitation that does not solve any needs. So, putting digital screen in every single pharmacy and bakery and wine shop and whatever you want, it's going to require an enormous amount of resources, but it's going to also add to your economy a lot of GDP points, but it's not going to increase quality of life. And so here, like the frame of, let's say, neoclassical economists that have been obsessing for a few decades about decoupling GDP from environmental pressures, then when you think about it for 2 seconds, you're like, why are we trying to green growth? I mean,
Right.
should we not be trying to green quality of life? And then you're like, wow. And if you try to do this, so instead of decoupling GDP, which is an obsolete indicator of prosperity, instead of decoupling that from footprint, try to decouple well-being,
Mm.
need satisfaction from footprint. And then you get yourself a complete different objective. You see that the goal of an economy in the 21st century is basically to just satisfy needs. So to max out the well-being that you can have out of a limited quantity of footprint itself, set by the biocapacity of your ecosystems. And that's a game changer when you do this. And we'll come back to that, because when we do this, we realize that many strategies that increase quality of life and that decrease ecological footprint, they don't involve growth in GDP, and that even they can involve the dismantlement, the shutdown, the lowering, the slowdown of certain economic activity.
Yeah, and I wanted just like to put to close. I love that last point, and to put a wrap around the decoupling part of our conversation. It does, after reading some of your stuff, I got pointed to, I think it's Helmut Haberl. He did a systematic review, evidence of decoupling of GDP, resource use, and GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, and they looked at like over 800 different articles, and essentially had found, spoiler alert, none of it was really worth for the most part, right?
Yeah, it's the first and largest systematic review of the decoupling literature, and it's an impressive two-part paper. And yeah, the result is that even though we've noticed certain cases of a lot of cases of relative decoupling, but again not a solution, and a handful of cases of absolute decoupling that very often are temporary and concerning only certain indicators, the overall message from that literature is that economic growth makes it more difficult to lower economic footprint, which I think a 5 years old could have deduced from
Yeah.
a single sentence from Kenneth Boulding, to be like, obviously, if you're trying to lower your use of natural resources, it's going to be easier if you produce and consume less than if you produce and consume more.
Right. So I feel like that's like a great transition into something I've tentatively called this portion of our conversation, what the actual fuck can we do? So what do we, what do we do about the situation? So all these decoupling, we're realizing maybe that's not the right route. Doesn't seem to be working very effectively. I had actually found this. I'm just going to pull up a quick slide of something I found in one of Nate Hagen's papers about the superorganism, where it's like this is a look at like the Mauna Loa monthly averages of CO2 and all of the different human social mileposts, which to me is like, this paints a really beautiful story of like what we're doing now. Clearly, the way we've organized around solving this problem isn't working. And so I guess I would pose to you, I've heard you say that this transition must be designed. And I know it can either happen on purpose or by disaster. Preferring the purposeful design transition, where do we start? How do we start to organize a more effective ecological transition while minimizing the drawbacks?
Uh, Difficult to answer that in one single sentence. I'm gonna differentiate between different questions here.
Okay.
The first one is first to stop producing and consuming more. So it means we need to phase out all incentives to produce things that we don't need. So advertising, for example, why do we advertise for plane tickets, for meat, and for very large cars, SUVs, when we actually environmentally we know that especially that's the kind of stuff we should consume less of. So here we see we're shooting ourselves on the foot,
Yeah.
because it's counterproductive. So phasing out advertising right now would be one way of, let's say, removing incentives to consume, in the same way that helping companies, and I'm saying helping in a very polite way, because you catch me on a good day, but there are other ways of doing it, helping businesses to transition to not-for-profit models, or like we witness among many cooperatives around the world, that are switching to a not-for-profit legal status. I mean, my colleague Jennifer Hinton in the US has been working for years in studying these businesses. And what's very interesting about our research is that it shows that these companies, they keep doing the same thing, that you would expect a company to do. It's a bunch of people organizing to produce something and to sell it and do what a business do. But they get rid of this kind of financial imperative, profit or perish.
Yeah.
And so these companies, they actually gain flexibility in trying to satisfy unmet needs that no one has ever tried to satisfy because there was no purchasing power in the people that have these problems. That includes most ecological issues because bees, they don't have dollars. They cannot pay. They will never pay. Whales neither. The climate even less. So somehow no one, it's very difficult to have them as customers. So if you're a for-profit business, you will never work to satisfy the needs of nature.
Right. Right.
And so if you transition, yeah.
I was going to say, if you're a for-profit business in a growth economy and you try to move to a non-for-profit or stop, that could also be just like bankruptcy, right?
That's why we need to change the rules of the game. And in a paper we published with some colleagues last June, we identified where we've read, we went through the degrowth literature. That's around 1,200 articles. I mean, mostly the first lead author, Nick, has been doing this amazing work, and we
Thank
identified 300. Yeah, that was a difficult summer for Nick. Reading all of that, but we identified 380 instruments, and so it's a systematic literature review of the degrowth literature, really focusing on instruments. How do we do this? And I think the main insight is that you cannot change a system by just pressing one button somewhere. If you have a systemic perspective, it's a bit more like acupuncture. You need to touch the system in many different places and in a specific order so that it works. And hence the importance, and we'll come back to this, of democracy. If all of a sudden you declare every business should do that, and most likely that's not going to work. I'm French, you know what's going on right now. That's not how change happen. So you need to find ways, so kind of things create synergies between different changes. So for example, like if right now we say we ban advertising for flights.
Yep.
And companies like for-profit airlines are going to be, oh shit, what are we going to do? Oh, let's do like Eden product placement here. Or what do? We're going to do sales on the ticket to try to attract more customers. But then if you just change the status of this company as being, okay, guys, you're now in one of the sector that is most strategic in decreasing greenhouse gases. Yeah. And so we cannot allow your company to distribute, profits based on the use of fossil fuels, the same way if you're an extractive company. So somehow you frame so that these companies can transition to a not-for-profit model, and then all of a sudden they, even from the internal logic of the company, they're like, we have no incentives to attract customers that would have not flown. Actually, that's good. If they don't need to fly, don't fly. Right. Then we will focus our limited resources on the people that really need to fly. And so we can avoid some of these flights. So it's all about just trying to find the synergies and changing things at these two levels of, symbols, indicators, the kind of like companies measuring their performance, using profits and certain like indicators of success. We need to change that. So this is kind of the software of the economy. Same thing. We need to get rid of GDP. I mean, that indicator is almost 100 years old. You would not run, we're not running somehow our computers and phones with software from 100 years old. Right. So why are we running our economy with this kind of, it's like it's like trying to fly a modern plane with like just the one stick you had in this like a World War First plane. Like that would not work well. So we need a new, more sophisticated dashboard of indicators showing ecological resilience, social health, showing us what's happening in terms of temporal budget, conviviality, things monetary, things non-monetary. And we want that also to show a systems perspective of like, how is that interacting? What happens when you cut down a forest? When you cut down a tree in town? Like in a GDP perspective, you make you create wealth. Well done, you've created wealth.
Right, you did it.
From an ecological economics perspective, you've destroyed so much wealth because that was house for pollinators, that was filtrating water, that was creating shadows for people, especially people that don't have
Yep.
the means, of paying for something else, that was cooling down cities during heat waves. And now you realize for the few bucks you've made producing whatever, coffee tables you made out of that single tree, you've destroyed thousands or even millions in ecological cost of all the stuff now that you will have to compensate by buying ACs and filtrating water with machine and constructing drones bees to pollinate your flowers or whatever green growth technology enthusiasts have in their tool belt.
So do you see this like the transition? Ideally, it's an intentional thing we do. We design it. Do you see it? It sounds like it's a mix of kind of top-down regulatory policy, new ways of governing, as well as like a bottom-up rising of how are people banding together? How are we coordinating and cooperating? Would you say that's a fair sense of how
Yeah,
you would imagine the approach working best? Yeah.
absolutely. Would not work without those two bits. And I mean, when you look at most changes, I mean, the way the economy works, if we acknowledge that the economy should be centered on needs, and that's the wonderful concept of well-being economy,
Yeah.
then it's very difficult to run an economy top-down because needs are local, they're contextual, they're changing. You need to
Well
always
said.
be able to discuss. This is why when you these democratic cooperatives, they can be potentially so much more innovative and flexible and agile than these big bureaucratic top-down corporations because you have people you can talk to, people inside the company, people outside of the company. That's these kind of multi-stakeholder boards. And when you produce something, you have access to information like, guys, we've thought of doing this connected digital toaster that allow you to read your mail as you're waiting for your toast to fry. And then within that board, when you're doing this, a for-profit company would be like, yeah, love it.
Yeah.
We'll make so much money out of this. Make sure we just break down all of the toasters so they have to replace it.
Right.
And then you would have, if you have a multi-stakeholder board, then you would have a representative of your engineers being like, are you fucking kidding? Like, I'm an engineer. I could build a spaceship. I'm not going to work on just making that stuff. And then you would have the representative of the local NGO being like, guys, we are already very short on carbon budget at the level of the city. We're in overshooting. We need to reduce. And of all the project we're doing, honestly, I'm not sure that's the one you want to pursue. And then you would have representative of your consumers being like, we don't need digital toasters. End of the story. That doesn't fit to any, actual needs. So why are we even wasting the time of, all the neurons in that room doing that?
Right.
And in 5 seconds, you would decide to do something that is very degrowth like. You'd be like, let's just not produce that. And so we realized that if over decades we've had this for-profit planning of the economy, very top-down decisions within within for-profit corporations of producing a lot of useless things, then now we kind of need a grand spring cleaning of being, what do we need to live a thriving life? And to decide that maybe that highway wasn't necessary. And actually, that was quite a sacrifice because we polluted some land, we disrupted some biodiversity, and that we can actually decide to stop using it, deconstruct it, rewild the land, and use that for other things. And so we can see here there is no linear development in economies. It's not like a plant that grows, and it's social systems. So whatever you build to be an office can become a school or something else. Whatever you build as a school can become housing and become a school after that. It's just a way of fitting basically, or means of production and consumption to actual needs. Before we talk about money, that's so important because money is a means of allocation. It's like who gets what. And it's not like, should not be the end of economic organization, but only a means. And since growth is only a measure of how fast you're piling up money, then that is even a more insidious end than just money itself. It's just looking at the speed at which you just aggregate money.
Yeah. as as our conversation here comes to a close, I know there's a trajectory here where degrowth is this immediate kind of requirement. There's pressure here to start slowing things down, or else the implications get worse and worse for us, right? But after that, there is the promise of hopefully a post growth future where we've moved beyond, we've transitioned into it. I'm wondering, just from you get to see, I know I've heard you mention you're collecting hundreds of different examples of where little maybe acupuncture points are working within different systems. I'm wondering if there's a few, maybe a couple examples of things you've seen or have experienced that are working in the real world, and for an individual who's listening to this and wondering, well, what on earth can I do? How could I contribute to this or help make a positive shift in the right direction towards a post-growth future? What are some of the things that people could do?
Yeah, before giving you a few examples, I just want to clarify. So, like, the difference between these two concepts of degrowth and post-growth. So, degrowth, we've defined it as these moments of downscaling. So, it's temporary. Is what you do when you're in overshoot. You've greened a few things, but that's not enough. So, you need to do more, and that thing more is produce and consume less. So, you undergo a phase of degrowth until basically your societal metabolism, the full weight of your economy in energy and materials, go down to match your biocapacity. So you say you fall back within planetary boundary. Once you've done this, in the same way that if you wanted to lose 20 kilos and you've lost 20 kilos, there's no need to keep losing 10, every year.
Yeah.
You stop. You're like, okay, now the goals shift from a degrowth economy to a steady state economy. So now basically you want to maintain that infrastructure, but the steady stateness of an economy in energy and material term does not imply the, let's say, stagnation in terms of culture and ideas. Actually, you shift in the same way that I'm the same height and, let's say, well, lying a bit, the same weight than I was when I was 25, but qualitatively, I'm a different person. I know much more. I've got much more friends. I've grown a family and everything, and so, in the same thing for an economy. The infrastructures stay the same, but you can have basically what people associate to the concept of growth, which is prosperity, thriving, development, innovation. All of that you can keep having. The only thing you need to make sure of is that the production and consumption of things, basically human agitation in general, stay in par with biocapacity. And so that's the steady state economy. And so a couple of examples of how to do this. The logic of quotas is, I think, underutilized by economists that love taxes a bit too much. Right now we're just putting taxes on things and we somehow expect that that's going to be problem solved. Actually, when you ask these pro decoupling economists what their solution for that, they only have one. It's almost laughable. Like, they only have one strategy, and it's a carbon tax. A carbon tax. And like, wow, we have a carbon tax. That means then we're going to create incentives to have technological progress, developed innovation that's going to allow us to have infinite economic growth. And I'm like, really? So one instrument to rule them all kind of strategy? Doubtful. But the problem with the tax is that you set the price, but you don't set the volume. So you put a tax on carbon, it's going to be X dollars per ton, but you don't know how many tons of carbons will be emitted at the end. It just depends on the behavior of people and how strong the incentive is. There's an uncertainty. The quota is the opposite. You set the volume, but you have uncertainty on prices. So when you have hunting quotas, like you have in many countries, or quotas for organ donations and stuff like this, well, you set every year there can be, there's that amount of organs available. And then, you set an allocation mechanism. You can auction the right to have access to that. In the case of the hunting quotas, or for organs, you can decide of a priority list. But you're certain that at the end of the year, you've not shot more mountain goats or whatever people hunt than are, available for these kind of activities.
Yeah.
And then the price is a human matter. Then you find a way that is fair, a way that can take into account, fairness of access, and all of that doesn't backfire. That's just human administration. Then we find a smart way of doing that. Right now, the question is, the priority is, if the priority is to lower natural resource use, then the logic of quota is more fail-safe, sorry, than the logic
Yep.
of the tax. And so
Yeah.
that's something we should be exploring. So, for example, if we come back to the example, if you're within a municipality that has decided to have what we call participatory budgeting, which means that when you draw the budget of the city, people are invited to participate, to do a little local citizen assemblies where people can actually vote on the project they prefer. You can do this in dollars, but you can also do this using natural resources. So for example, like, okay, guys, we have this carbon budget for next year. Now, like most cities needs to have carbon budget, so they will know that number.
Yep.
And we have a couple of projects going on. We want to extend the parking here. We want to have this road. We want to rewild that stuff. We want to do this and that. We've calculated that somehow if we do all of that, we will use 160% of our carbon budget. And so we need somehow to decide, what do you prefer? And then we do what humans do best. We discuss and show, this, maybe we can wait for next year or put that on hold, and ta-da-da. And we do decision making. So here we see, like, through something as specific as these citizen assemblies, part of a participatory budget. That's one specific institution that does not exist, that we could invent. I mean, it exists in some cities, but let's say some cities could learn from the experiences of others to introduce this as a concrete instrument to allow us to do some things. I'll give you a couple of other fun stuff. Energy currencies. That's the one I like, is the concept of complementary currencies. So when I tell you about money, most people think like, yeah, dollars, like state money.
Yep.
But there are also local currencies running, or even the broad family of complementary currency. Bitcoin, digital currencies are complementary in the sense that they run in parallel to the dollars. But there are also cuter and, in my opinion, more useful currencies that you can find. In France, we have more than 80 of them in certain regions or sometimes certain cities. Wow. Where these communities have self-organized their own currencies, often to basically gain the ability to self-invest into projects, for the ecological transition. And energy currency is an interesting way of financing a renewable infrastructure project. So imagine you convince everyone in your city that is mostly being fueled with unrenewable energies to be like, guys, we want to transition to, let's say we want to build a solar farm. Yep. Or your district, but we don't have the money to do that. Let's say, okay, well, we want to make sure that this solar farm is going to be viable over the very long term. Then you can invest in building that solar farm, and you will be paid back in kilowatts. And you can even have circulate a currency that you could call like the watt dollar, whatever, where each unit is actually linked to a quantity of kilowatt. So that does a few things for you. First, through that, it makes sure that the quantity of money in circulation always remains connected to your biocapacity, because that's something much more concrete. You cannot, if you're the central bank, if you're the monetary association of that little village, you cannot be, let's just print unlimited money. No, you can only print as much money as you can produce kilowatts, which is a very good way of making sure your economic activity remains embedded within the available energy. And so just like that little tricks that communities have developed, it's not economists like myself that developed it in university and we went there and be like, guys, you should try this. No, it's just communities that have found means of organizing their own transition. The transition town movements is a famous framework that you can look up for some of these tools. And my next book will actually be a kind of synthesis of another list I have, this time with 1,000 of these kind of initiatives, different initiatives at different level of the economy that will connect together into an ideal, typical alternative economic system. I call it the Jurassic Park of post-capitalism. Like John Hammond spared no analytical expense. I've built it, and I'm going to show how it works like this, so that it inspires people to basically realize that, the economy is a social construction. And so as such can be deconstructed, reconstructed at will. The only thing we will not be able to argue with is the laws of biology and physics.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess my last, I've got a handful of like quick questions for you, but my last one, what I've really loved about listening to you, reading your work, is that, in a, and I'm curious about it, it seems like you somehow have been able to withstand reading all sorts of horribly depressing, potentially anxiety-inducing research about the state of the world and where things are going, and yet I feel like you have such an energy and an excitement about how things could be better. So I'm wondering where that, like, how you're able to guard yourself against just kind of like sitting in your room and waiting for the world to burn after reading all the things you have, and where your optimism or hope comes from for the future.
Uh, that's a question I'm asking myself too, because I've been working on this for a few years, and I don't remember the last one I've seen a good news concerning actually like environmental situation. So it's very easy to be depressed about. What gives me power? Of what gives me not power but optimism? What empowers me to keep working on that right now is all the climate activism we see around, like act of bravery of people blocking a pipeline or a road, or or spray painting a bank, or just throwing food at a glass painting or stuff like this. Just all the creativity and energy that especially the younger generation mobilizing around these issues. When I see this as a scientist, it means like I need to make the best I can do to equip these people with whatever analytical tools they need. And
Yeah.
and so it's every day a reminder of the responsibility we have, being, having been educated for 15 years and studying, how the economy work. I would feel like absolutely terrible to go work for a bank and just make a bit of money for myself.
Mm.
And so that gives me optimism. And then the second bit is to look also at the the like, now I'm going to sound really like a theorist, but I am a theorist. I'm a
Yeah.
theoretical economist, so I don't do case studies and stuff like this. I sit in my office and I mind travel into things, and and on paper it works.
Mm.
Like it like I've never understood. And I started studying economics 15 years ago, and I was told these kind of like, greed is good, the economy will decouple, wealth trickle down, capitalism is, the Everest of human civilization. I was like, sounds like, really? And they were like, Tim, don't be too critical, you know nothing. Do a bachelor. I did a bachelor, then I was like, I still think this is bullshit. They're like, well, do a master's, you understand. I did a master's, still thought that was bullshit. They're like, okay, do another. I did another master's, still thought that. I was like, do a PhD. I did a PhD, and I was like at some point, I'm not going to wait to receive the Nobel Prize. There's no need to do 5 PhDs to realize that our system is just broken.
Yeah.
It's broken. Many people know it. Actually, it's not even, you don't need to know theory about this. And so our system is broken, but the amount of solutions that are lying around is so heartwarming. It's like we have so much stuff, like the toolbox is full of possibilities. And so when you match this to the energy we see in movements and people that are willing, to risk, like going to prison to block a road and to send a message to the world that we are risking extinction and that we need to do something, and you match this with the creativity of so many activists and scholars that have over decades, invented the wildest, most exuberant alternatives to every single thing you can think of. I'm like, we have the maps, we have the will, we have the toolbox. What are we waiting for? And I'm too young to be pessimist, so I'm gonna keep on that energy for as
I
long as
love
I
it.
can.
I love it. Well, we need more of it, and I'm 100% with you. And the French have always had a good way of making change. It's been exciting to watch what's up and what's going on the last couple weeks there. I want to round out with just a handful of quick questions for you. I know you talked about analytical tools or frameworks you can use. I'm wondering for you, it doesn't have to be your favorite, but maybe it's one that you came across as like a thinking tool, a framework, a lens that you've used in your work that you think people might find helpful in problem solving or thinking about things differently.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's
You have a good one that
Hartmut
comes to mind.
Rosa, German sociologist.
Okay.
He wrote a book, social theory of acceleration, and is basically the analytical framework is to try to understand human societies based on their relation with time.
Oh boy.
And for me, that changed my life as an economist, because before, I this concept of time and the speed of economies. So in my PhD thesis, I conceptualize using Hartmut Rosa economic growth as acceleration,
Mhm.
and degrowth as a kind of deceleration for a return to some kind of harmony.
Yeah.
And it's
Mm.
a bit of hardcore German sociology to read. It's but I can vouch that it's worth. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Once you've read it, you will forever see human institutions and whatever is happening as time relations, and that's great because we all have an individual relationship with time. So that also empowers us to think about, like, okay, how much time do I dedicate? I mean, that fact alone. I mean, imagine in we in terms of budget, so the idea of time budgets, we each have a 24 time budget. Like this is not changing.
Yeah.
That'll be the same. And we need to eat and sleep and all of that, so we actually have less available of that time budget. And when you think of accumulation of money and all that stuff, it feels like the logic of infinite is there. The time budget will never expand. So
Right.
this kind of logic makes you completely rethink both, like, practical decisions. Do I really want to spend 10 years of my life going to business school just to design online ads for digital toasters?
Yeah.
Or, do I actually want to do something else with my hours?
Mhm.
And also macroeconomically, which means politically. Do we really want to spend our neurons and our hours into, wasting almost creative minds by locking them into cubicles, imposing them standard, like, quotas of ads to produce online and stuff like this? Or do we want to use these minds to solve more pressing problems? So, listeners, Hartmut Rosa, social theory of acceleration, you won't regret it.
This is my next rabbit hole that I'm gonna be going down. All right, a couple more quick ones. Is there an idea that you're chewing on right now? You've put a lot out into the world that's fully processed, or at least you've worked through. Is there something right now that you're kind of like chomping on, thinking through, excited about?
Yeah, okay, there's some this is the first time I talk about it, but I've uh I've read a novel, which doesn't happen very often because I read a lot of economics book, and I've read, someone sent me that novel, a French novel, which is a utopian novel
Hmm.
about a constructed society that the author called Miserarchy. And I found out that the guy that wrote the book was this nerdy law professor in a French university specialized in, housing law. And he developed in the utopia the idea of melting housing prices, which I won't have time to explain here, but it's a completely different way of pricing houses.
Huh.
And so that led me to an irreversible interest into that topic, which is extremely important when we talk about economic growth and also a footprint in general, construction being a huge contributor to that.
Yeah.
And so now I'm writing an article starting from a study of that imaginary world, coming back to the present,
I love it.
uh, playing with that idea of, the pricing of things, very much generally, not only of houses, but how do we determine a price? And coming back to perhaps what was the initial question of political economy, what constitute a fair price for something, from also an ecological economics perspective,
Yeah.
from also taking into account this kind of time dimension. So that's going to be an article maybe for the end of this year. I'm not sure where it's going, but it sure is exciting.
All right, eyes are peeled. I'm excited about that one. Last question for you. I had told you you were on my top 10 list of people I wanted to talk to and learn more about what you were thinking. I'm wondering if the tables were turned, who's like, what's one mind you'd like to get inside? Who would you like to other mind with if you could?
Oh, wow. Uh, so, okay, you know what? I have to say, Beth Stratford.
Okay.
She's a British economist, and she's been working a lot on that concept of rent. So
Okay.
not rent in the sense of you're paying rent to your landowner, but that rent in economics being able to profit from a situation of power. Like, let's say the pharmaceutical industry can have rent because it's owners of some patent and they can just set prices they want. So basically, rent as the concept of unearned income, something that you don't deserve. And she's been building this fantastic political economic reflection on power relations around rent, which has to do also with price formation. So you see, it connects with my latest obsession.
Yeah, right.
And I think you should, talk to her for sure.
Beth Stratford, is that what?
Yeah.
Awesome, excellent. Okay, so lastly, Timothée, where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work?
TimothéeParrique.com is my website. I'm trying to keep it updated with everything I do, speak, read, and a endless list of stuff, like 700 articles in the degrowth literature and stuff like this. If you want to learn more about this, that's a good way to start. And of course, if you want to know more, drop me a mail. There is a contact form there, and I'll be very happy to send you some more stuff.
Awesome. Well, Tim, thank you so much for your time. This conversation has been one I've been looking forward to for a long time. I felt like I learned a whole lot of new stuff just through talking through some of these ideas with you. I appreciate your time, the little bit that we have here on Earth. Thanks you for spending some of it with me, and I hope you have I'm excited to see what's next from you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this discussion.
Great.